Chapter 3 The Misdeeds of Gardy Ardifir. Stories of our people are false 99 times of every 100, and that last of them is only near to the truth. Rarely do we learn about history honestly. It seems not to be our way. We prefer fables with tinges of darkness to the whole bloody truth. All save for myself, I should think. From the Journal of Finley Ardifir. They were gone not an hour after Finley first fell into his dreams. Swain had quickly packed their things the moment that Nim returned, despite his uncooperative behavior, and while the moon was climbing high, they set off through the forest. With some extra time, having set aside another hour for their resting, but not having needed it, they opted to travel through the forest and risk an easier but longer road. They were sick of the last crag and wanted no more part in their foul pathways. Finley was forced to wonder what would happen to the travelers who'd gotten so used to using the southern road. With the crag half shattered and wholly unstable, even beyond how much it had been, new roads would needs be developed or devised to travel quickly between the three major townships. The smaller towns in between still held their same purpose but had no normal need to travel. Many of them kept to themselves in a considerably more secluding fashion and seldom attended to outside events. Even the festival, which held promise and joy for a great many of the Sith, was of little interest to the people of Schnee, Walbrook, and Oslo. Because of this, they tended not to care over the in- and outbound roads, and left them to the larger towns where travelers lived. "It's not a road we use, so why should we care for it?" they would say, and ever more often in Schnee, where tensions between the other towns seemed to strike hardest and hottest. The forest was a fairly uneventful portion of the journey. Finley and Swain managed to move fairly quickly between the trees and along the base of a few hills which dotted the landscape around the crags. As far as Finley could remember, there were no challenges along the route they'd chosen that night, and as long as they kept their feet and didn't lose their way, they'd arrive sometime after midnight. They didn't expect either of their companions to be awake upon their arrival, though there was a faint hope that they'd be wrong. To be welcomed by Elise and Everett would have been a nice end cap to their little struggle, though it was assumed that the whole affair had already been spun into a strange and misrepresented tale of heroism, danger, and vast tribulation. Finley expected no renown from such a story. Had he been the first to tell it, he could have painted the picture clearly and accurately, though it would have been taken with an approximate mountain of salt, and he'd have been doubted on his family's reputation alone. Even if Everett and Elise had told it true, the likelihood of him being honored as any kind of hero or do-gooder was rather remote. Years ago, that might have bothered him, but he'd grown used to it beyond the stain of his long nights in deep thought. As they'd planned, the mood was just past its apex when they saw the small village appear in the lowlands beyond the forest edge. Nim crept up to the edge of a slope where the forest gave way to a decline in the ground. The proper road appeared from the east, snaking down in between a few taller hills and dodging between a stray tree or two until it entered the walled settlement of Schnee. In the moonlight, from half a mile away, they could almost see the nightlife of the village. A few dappled, dark shapes moved in and out of the light near the gates of the village, and it seemed plain that people were coming and going as they often did. Finley considered himself lucky that they'd not been accosted by a pack of wild dogs during their journey, but it was still only 12 hours or so since they left home, and there was enough time for many more problems along the way. They started down the hill with careful steps. Nim had no problem navigating the slope, though Swain seemed to stumble every other step, and Finley would have been anything but surprised to see him rolling down the hill like a snowball to crash against the lone tree between them and the village. He chuckled to himself at the thought, imagining a perfect sphere of odd shades, blue and gray and streaked with brown from his clothes, tumbling down the smooth hill and striking a wooden log. Further, he imagined a sort of gassy explosion upon the end of said journey. He couldn't hide the merry chortle that wanted so desperately to escape, and it served only to further distract Swain, who very nearly made the whole affair a reality. When they arrived at last to the village, they found a number of very drunk Sith heading out of town. From far, they swore that they could see others arriving, but by the time that they themselves did just that, there were no others coming in with them. It was a small and somewhat odd place as far as the Sith went. Finley would likely have felt much more at home there, as their traditions were less strange and meaningless and seemed to be more practical. Unlike back in Minhir, the people in Schnee tended to speak openly of their problems. It was simply a common understanding that when they were mentioned, you were not by any means expected to help. To request help with something personal was still taken badly, though not so much as in other places around the island. The town was small, populated by no more than 100 residents, though it seemed far grander in scale whenever Finley visited. It was a hub and a resting place for travelers, and as he'd only seen it around the festival's date each year, he'd experienced the busiest time of year exclusively. The village proper was about 20 buildings built in 2 rings around a central hill. A large well sat atop the hill, and encircling it was a thin and winding road often traveled and well-trodden. The thing that truly set the village apart was the common buildings. Every home was built of a unique tree, called quite appropriately a home tree. All of them had a thick trunk that splayed into several dozen lazy limbs. The limbs arched outward and formed a sort of apple shape, hollowing in the middle with an outer wall of thin branches that the locals would weave together into a proper structure. Here and there, they would open gaps in the braids to make windows or doors, but the houses grew continuously, and a great deal of work was required to keep them in good order. The older trees made up the central ring of the village and were old enough to have second stories, the branches having been propped and wrapped back upward to form another wall, dipping back towards the center and climbing further skyward. Only one building in town was old enough to have 3 stories, and the old Sif who lived there was among the oldest Sif on the entire island. Garibald, or Old Man Burgess, was 224 years old. He was called Old Man not for his age, but for the way he carried himself along with his stature. He was a considerably sized fellow and held himself like the legends of elderly men across the sea. He crutched on a cane and leaned heavily forward, belying his height, which was more than most could dream to reach. He wasn't the oldest Sif to ever live, though, and that honor belonged to the elder Keat, who had no surname. She was nearing on 300, though the exact count of her years was unknown. Her mind had wandered far, and after a point no longer returned. Stories were told that she had the far sight, as some elders claimed, and had spent so long looking in on distant shores that she'd gotten lost. They say her mind wanders in the deserts of the West, and will do so until her body fades away into living memory. The Burgess home rose like a tower on the right just as they entered the village. It had been the first, and from it the whole of Schnee had been erected. It was 50 feet high, a sort of series of oddly shaped lumps stacked atop one another, all wrought in braided wood and illuminated by many candles within. Finley always fancied that building as, much like his own family, it was an honored kind of structure, and brought great renown to the ones who'd built it. If there was one thing that he understood perfectly well and agreed with wholly, it was the idea that respect and communion with nature, and the ability to wield and craft with it, still without destroying, was worth renown and sometimes even fame. His grandfather had been called one of the greatest Dommel craftsmen on the island, and that honor once marked their family as great and respectable. He was always surprised and somewhat stunned when he considered just how fast a long-lived reputation like that could go sour, but he tried not to think of it often. Swain was very distracted as they headed through the village. It wasn't more than half a mile across, but felt sprawling because of how much tended foliage decorated the area. Gardens were well built and even better sectioned. The growth was beautiful and colorful, and even the outdoors were lit by many candles. Finley's eyes were searching harder, though, and here and there he noticed more peculiar things than he'd seen there previously. He swore, to his reckoning at least, that a person or two seemed to hide their faces from view. As painting one's face was a mark of pride, it seemed strange to have some hiding their paint entirely, though it was certainly not marked as rude or against tradition. Finley felt like maybe he was overthinking it, but along with their strange positioning and deep, dark hoods, they seemed to be skulking around areas that were otherwise quite empty. Ever their eyes loomed across the town, and as the only part of their faces that were visible, it appeared like an owl in the pitch black hunting for mice on the forest floor. They made him quite uncomfortable, and forced him to hurry his steps along, almost dragging Swain behind him to one of the 2-story buildings, nearer to the other side of the village. Outside of the structure, they saw a sign dangling from a gnarled, curved branch in front. It was an inn called the Old Otter, and was their intended resting point in Schnee. It was a new inn, and had previously been a home for someone who'd since gone off to some unknown fate in the common mind. Whether they'd just left or disappeared wasn't guessed at, though stories formed, of course, of secret trysts and well-kept plans. Along the side of the building, 2 horses and a wagon were tied to a few poles on the fence, and it was a comforting thing to see. The worry that had marred both Swain and Finley melted away like butter on warm bread, and they felt glad of it. They entered hastily and searched for their companions. Around the room were 7 tables, and in the center of the tree was a strange hearth. Somehow, they'd built a chimney into the center of the trunk of the tree, and whether it was dead or had just been done with some unknown skill was unclear. The fire within burned brightly, fueled by large cylinders of pine tar and wood pulp from trimmed branches and overgrowth. This was a common way to use up the excess wood that houses would grow in such a short order. Everett and Elise were nowhere to be seen on the first floor, and after asking the barkeeper, who stood on the far end of the room in a small alcove between two thickly braided branches, they were sent upstairs to the bedrooms. A room was waiting for them already, and 2 of the other 3 were occupied. They knocked on the first door and received no answer. After a time, they moved on to the other. They were greeted pleasantly with an unexpected and very short embrace from Elise, who seemed quite worried over their safety. Her face was stricken, though relaxed quickly at the sight of them. The awful, nagging feelings that had drained her of energy and mirth were stripped and tossed aside, and once again she was joyful as anyone could be. Somehow, her usual chipper attitude seemed emphasized after that, a thing which neither Swain nor Findlay even thought was possible. Of the 3, she was by far the most energetic and playful, and showed a great deal of low cunning when circumstance required it. She was better at talking her way in and out of situations than anyone else they knew. There, in the room as Everett slept soundly, she asked with exuberance about their journey. She was desperate for the tale and asked them not even to spare the earlier details wherein she'd been involved. Swain did so joyously, and much to Finley's surprise and delight, he painted a picture most kindly to him. Finley was cast as a figure of great deeds, and even the shadow he cast in the story seemed powerful and grand. Elise couldn't help but smile and questioned whether it had been true after her leaving. He hadn't embellished too much, save for the invented struggles of Finley in the deep woods alone and faced with 6 wolves, and Findley's tangling with a vagabond in the deepest night, who gave a good fight before fleeing into the inky blackness between the encircling trees. Swain admitted his additions, and named them clearly, but still, Elise was impressed, and her smile only further spread as she knew the whole truth of it, save for the conversation shared in private. The blade was not to be discussed. That much had been stated on the road through the forest as they rode and ate. They had agreed that Finley's reputation was bad enough without rumors of his hoarding arcane and deeply confusing objects in hidden places around his home. Whether true or not, it was quite an unwanted splash of flavor to his considerable infamy. For a while they talked quietly and gathered themselves for the next day's journey. Finley pulled a map from his rucksack and pointed to the location of Schnee on it. From there, their journey would take them west and north along the river's edge. The banks would rise high and take them through the relatively quiet country without much expected complication. After the bridge, they'd be very near to Fairhill, though the full day's journey there would require a night's sleep without much comfort. The only towns between Schnee and Fairhill were the ones barely to be called as such. They were small and had no more than 10 isolated sif each. They were close-knit communities, and in the past year they proved anything but welcoming to those who traveled along the river's bank. Ever moving onward, they would take little rest in Fairhill, 1 night at most, as its comforts were not enough to waste time there. The biggest mystery of their whole journey would lie between Fairhill and Lemoir, where the Woolfields lay, and in passing that way, the threat of attack by animals grew tenfold. Those fields were an open expanse of dangerous wildlands, scarcely forested with rocky dens and outcrops, proving perfect to house packs of large wolves. Even the local night hunts that had occasionally marred their passage were nothing compared to the tales, even the most conservative ones, of the Woolfields and their hunters. Elise looked worried at the mention of the Woolfields. She was the only one in the group who'd traveled them before. In previous years, there had been an easier road between the 2 towns, but in the spring of that very year, a storm had blown up the Southwash, and with it, a great current flowed powerfully across the Aylstream. 3 bridges all along the main pathway were torn asunder and washed away. In autumn, the Aylstream, particularly near Fairhill, became impassable without a proper bridge. The rapids would surely waylay them if they tried to conquer those roads, and it seemed only reasonable to find newer roads, less traveled and less civilized. Everett stirred, and though both Swain and Elise were arguing against the Woolfields, the voice of the elder in their party proved enough to silence them. "We've no choice. We can't risk the cargo, so we need to take the bridge to the north and cross this comin' morn. He's told it true. We're luckless here, but we don't want to head home now. This is our chosen road, like it or no." "Well, we don't." Swain crossed his arms childishly, and Elise, trying to hold back her laughter at the immaturity, snorted loudly and covered her mouth. Finley was mirthless. He was the most worried of them, and as the first leg of their journey had already proved ill, he had little hope for ease in their travels. For a while they slept, but not for long. They awoke well before morning, and their minds were driven clearly in the direction of some merriment before their road grew harsh once more. They gathered on the first floor. Once they were dressed and packed, and while Everett brought the luggage back to the cart, the others claimed an empty table nearest to the hearth by the door. There were two other groups, and while one was joyous and full of drunken exuberance, the other was very nearly silent. Finley glanced between them, fingering the hilt of his knife idly as he stared. He made his eavesdropping quite hard to read, throwing his fur cloak over his head and leaning down on his arms as they crossed beneath his chin. Here and there he sipped the mug of ale that had been brought to him. He paid enough attention to his friends to misdirect them, and they thought nothing more than he was tired and in need of some small amount more sleep. He groaned lazily, focusing his pointed ears and bending them as best he could towards the group of silent patrons. He listened closely as soon as the conversation at his own table had severed him from the subject. Elise and Swain were talking over smaller and more personal matter between them, a matter that Finley had not been involved in. At the opportunity, Finley focused desperately across the room. His eyes darted between the three figures, but they were still too shrouded for him to make out any details in their faces. Bitterly, Finley leaned in closer, if only a few inches. It didn't serve him at all, and he hoped, above all else, that he might glean something of interest from their conversation. Once, before he'd wriggled into understanding their conversation, he thought that one might have looked over at him, but it was a doubtful thought, and uncertain at best.
He was supposed to have come round here, though it was way back, who's to say? Could have left it anywhere.
One of the figures spoke, and when the second answered, their voices were so similar that Finley could scarcely tell them apart. The same occurred when the third seemed to speak, or so he thought. He couldn't have been sure at any point who was speaking and who was answering.
Faithless scum. There's nothing for it. After all we've tried, we just have to keep going, keep working at it. Can't be gone altogether. We'd know if it was. Aye. No one leaves this island, save for death and deep diggers. Do you think it's the mountains, then? Nah, I don't think he was a stoneworker, he was a woodsman. Woodsman?
One scoffed, and the sound was loud enough to be heard without focus or bent attention.
Ah, he was. Reputation means more to them to speak of it than gold or good mead round here. I haven't had a drop of good mead in so long. And you won't, not till we find that which we've been charged to find. Oh, let's just shove off and find our way free. Right, 'cause crossing the North Wash with nothing to show wouldn't bode ill.
A sudden shushing sound came from one of them. Their rising voices were cut off at once, and Finley closed his eyes through reflex and nothing more. He heard a dull clatter as Everett returned, and turning, Finley saw Everett sit beside him. When he glanced back at the table of strangers, they'd vanished entirely. The door swung limply back and forth as the rattle of feet echoed beyond the door.
Sorry it took so long,
Everett apologized, and of course didn't understand why Finley was so frustrated. An answer, or more so an excuse, came to pass just then, and removed any questioning that might have otherwise complicated the matter. From across the room, the merry group of drunken Sith had started the long and winding tale of the Ardifir family. Everyone glanced at Finley, who acknowledged and further expressed his distaste, though it had earnestly shifted towards the patrons at the far table.
So I hear that old Gardy lured his brother to the coast and somehow convinced him to make a crossing to the mainland. Some strange business must have gone on there, and of that I can't claim to know, 'cause news from past the wide waters is none and then less, even to those who listen close and look hard. Still, only one came back, and even then it were years for Julius showed his face alone in men here.
One man spoke, and Finley rolled his eyes.
Oh, that's just the cover. Old Gardy tried to bring men back to our shores. Aye, I said men, but there's the one who trade him, and they drowned him in the wash 'fore he could make it home. Seems to me they had some business on the wash, and some secret was on old Gardy's lips that they wanted him not to tell, but Julius escaped and went home, found his family mostly broken. There must be a reason that he was ne'er seen again after a fashion, and he only came home a half a week 'fore he vanished,
a woman corrected, and her tone was more confident. Still, the first Sith laughed derisively at her. A third spoke with strength and authority next, and his voice was thick as his aged white beard. Finley knew from look alone that this third Sith was an elder, one whose years spanned past 100. His beard was enough to tell that much, and the age-bearing lines of his face, matched against his wizened eyes, spoke further of his age and influence.
You're all mad. Julius wasn't even involved. Gardy headed off on his own and tried to turn home but never made it. Julius didn't go nowhere and did nothing more than try to bring his brother home from the shore. They met there, and from what I'd heard, Gardy made it back alright but left again. The whole drowning, seems to me, was made up to cover his misdeeds, but who can say rightly? So long this story's changed, and with it a dozen more ended up folded in with things that just might have been true. We can't suppose to act like the stories told a quarter century hence bear any resemblance to the ones we tell now. So hush yourselves and stop babbling. You've no more news than anyone else, and I've heard enough. Sides, you're being rude. A story's a story, but often stories are told by thems that want attention. These stories were told off of eavesdrops and spying, and are more family business than public news. Leave it to history, and let it alone, I say.
Finley felt a strange appreciation for the old Sith who'd defended him, whether he'd meant to or not. It was only when the old fellow glanced over at Finley and gave a pitying smile that it became understood openly. The old fellow knew more than he'd say, surely, and knew well enough that an Ardifir was in the room and listening close, clearly with no enjoyment. Whether the story would continue after they left didn't matter, and furthermore, would not be known to those who'd care. Finley felt easier, and let his rough mood dwindle beneath the hearty embrace of his ale. With a few drawn-out sips, he mustered his strength and feigned a proper smile. The others looked relieved, as their expectation was inching towards Finley throwing a punch. Somehow, that would be more acceptable than most mistakes that a Sith could make. They didn't often fight, but it was generally accepted that a fight typically had a reason, and it was personal business. If otherwise, or random in nature, it would be made clear, and therein lied the faux pas. At length, the group drank through 2 pints of ale each and wavered slightly on their stools as the breathy, ale-soaked air seemed to drag them left and right. Finley was not so moved, and though he himself had drank an extra pint, he seemed no worse for it. His mind remained clear, and such a large amount of alcohol served only to lighten his mood slightly. Evermore his mind reached outward from home, further his eyes glanced from his small hut, and far afield did his gazing go. Through the sight of his mind he wondered if his family name would be forgotten with time, or whether far-off lands were an easier erasure of his ill renown. And there it was, the thoughts that had so marked his family with disdain, brought to him not by them, but by those who had hated him for deeds that he himself had not done. It was their pushing against him that ever inched him towards the precipice, and made him loath to want to stay on the island at all. Presently he became aware of just how awful those ideas seemed to him. If he were already judged harshly, what would it do to his name to leave? Even for a time? Meaning well to return? After some time he realized just how long he'd been staring off towards the braided wooden window. Through thick and uneven stained glass, his cobalt and violet eyes had grown quite vacant. The luster in them didn't fade or wander, but they still seemed to deaden somehow and grow distant. Elise had roused him from his stupor, and assuming that he was simply drunk, forgave him for his lack of attention. They finished their drinks and ate well of stewed lamb and soft, warm bread. They dipped their small, thin loaves into the thick broth and let it sop up into the folds and knots of steaming softness. Butter ran from between the deep-cut lines and sparkled in small pools atop the stew amid the lamb fat and spices. The warm and cozy feelings provided by such a meal would surely not last, and for a full day more they would likely not have such a feast if no delays were met. With delay, they would find perhaps 2 days without comfort in their food, and gathered to themselves a large wheel of Minhir's sharp cheese for each person in the company. They brought fresh, unbaked dough for the road, and would let it rise during their travel. Atop a fire, a fresh loaf could be baked and enjoyed to supplement and continue the warmth of their last great meal. The sun had only just risen in the window when they'd finished their food and gathered what supplies they had want of. Far beyond the mountains and fields, a luminous yellow marble swirled through uneven glass, and about it, beyond the colored glass, clouds started to ring the sky. With a pleasant warmth surging through their bodies, Finley and his company rose from their seats and prepared to exit. Finley himself took a moment and spoke. "You all go on ahead, get things settled in the cart. I'll only be a moment," he said, turning aside and seeking out the elder Sith who defended him so plainly. It took a short while, but after searching around the room, he realized that the old Sith was not there any longer. Asking the bartender, Finley sat patiently as the young elder who owns the establishment gathered himself in thought.
"Well, I wouldn't usually divulge such information, but you seem pleasant and quiet lad after all. Saw you there at your table, sitting near silent, not making a fuss. I'd have trouble imagining that you have any ill will for the old man."
Finley was suddenly taken aback, but didn't show much reaction, save for a twinge of his eyebrows and unspoken interest.
Well, old Garibald ventured on home, so he's likely to be there or on the way, if not. Sometimes he stops in the market to pick up supper fixins for his family, but he'll likely be in the south end of town near the gate. Yeah, you reach it, that's your goal.
Thank you very much, Finley said, and placed a silver token on the bar, which was swept back and up with amazement by the barkeep, who was in silent splendor of it. Finley left the old otter, and from there greeted his friends. With a steady heart masking his intentions and his chosen secrets, he told them that he had some small business in the south of town before they set off. We plan to set off ere the sun reaches half between the mountains and its highest, so you've time to settle whatever fares you need. As for me, I think I'll head to the market, so that far at least, I'll escort you, Everett said with a wide, wry smile. Swain and Elise opted instead to go westward to the craft quarter. Swain had expressed a desire for a new set of cookware and a hatchet for their travels. Elise seemed further worried over days ahead and showed interest in a small crossbow for protection in the wool fields and a heavy refillable torch to scare off beasts in the night and light their way better. The two groups departed from one another, and though Swain and Elise were talkative as they left, Finlay was too deep in his thoughts to say much to Everett. Everett, for his part, tried to carry the conversation on his own, and proved equal to the task.
You did well back there, Trouble, he comforted. Now, before you say anything, I know I said I'd leave that name behind, but I thought it were fitting in this context. You proved better than I thought you would in there with that rabble going on about your family. Still, I know it bled you deep and you're likely worn down from it, so I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. You've grown already, since a week ago, and you've shown yourself better than most think of you. I'm sure in no small way you've saved our lives wholly on the road so far, and hopes I that we won't need you to again. There it is. If we do, you're here, and I'm thankful for it.
He continued talking over much smaller matters, far harder to recall at length. For near on 5 full minutes, he spouted silly musings over the beauty of the town and the splendor of the wilds as they'd been that year. He asked questions over Finley's travels during the previous night, though he answered himself in time with supposition or assumption. Some were far off, some were nearer to the mark. At the market, Everett splintered away and walked into a small boutique, wherein he vanished from view. Finley continued on without acknowledgement and moved swifter still to the tallest house in the village. At the door, he stared up at the knobby structure above him, rising like a tower of dough balls skyward. They were dark, halfway between black and a deep brown, and all about there were bright windows through which candles glowed warmly. On either side of the door, a small sconce hung from a looped bough, and in them a thick tarry oil blazed very bright. The door opened, though no one seemed to stand behind it, and Finley entered without a word or a greeting. The door shut behind him swiftly, and all about the large, round room the flames on each candle was disturbed by the sudden wind. Scampering footfalls echoed through the half-lit and half-shaded space, though Finley couldn't see a figure to have made them. He felt ill at ease, but after a few moments of tense silence, a brighter light descended from the central pillar. A lantern on a chain, wide and bright with blazing tar, lit the room fully and with a pleasant warmth. It seemed to him a source of heat, joy, and light alike. In the corner, nearest to the spiral stair on the left side, a small scythe, no older than 9 summers, slipped away and up the steps, and from the shaft that he'd risen along, a small, thin voice called down and invited him up. He did as he was bid, and carefully climbed the stairs. On the leftmost wall, small portraits painted in bright and vibrant color displayed the faces of a great many scythe, all similar in their look and feel. He didn't know their names, but guessed that all of them were quite closely related, as father and son or sister and brother, as their noses were all bulbous and wide, and their eyes all matched in color and brightness. As he entered the second floor, he saw the small scythe hoisting up the chained lantern, and there it once again lit the floor on which they stood. The young thing danced away up to the 3rd floor next, and there vanished, never to return while Finley was still present. On the far side of the room, in an alcove beneath the second staircase, the old scythe sat, smoking a pipe of red fog and breathing plumes of bloody smoke into the room. He gestured with his hand for Finley to join him, and once again in silence, Finley did just as he was bid. They sat in silence for what seemed like only a few moments, but was closer to half an hour, and in that time Finley was offered a pinch of the freshest red smoke that was still smokable. He gladly took it and tamped it into his pipe, smoking deep and long so that his nerves would be calmed. At length, the old scythe spoke, and his voice was somehow very strong despite his aged appearance and what was surely many long years of smoke-filled lungs. "I hoped you'd come, but I didn't expect it, if I'm to speak truthfully, yearling." Finley was surprised, and his face couldn't hide it, even with the smoke before his eyes and mouth and streaming from each nostril. "You know of me?" "Aye, I know of you. In earlier years, I've seen you at the festival, but I'm too old for the crossing now, and the roads are harsh. Had I the strength of a younger Sif, I'd go and aid the repairs, but I'm weak and not long for this world." Finley couldn't help but feel saddened by the news, as he seemed from little more than his tone and some small observations to be a strong and willful Sif worth honoring and remembering. "I, for one, shall remember you, Gerald, whether you're here for a day or for many years to come," Finley said honorably, and the old Sif smiled heartily. "That is well. I would be remembered, I hope, for the things I've done, rather than the things I've not," he said wistfully. In his thick brogue there was a sadness and regret, a kind of melancholy hard to place or measure. Still, it was clear as a bell to Finley, whose own voice held such tones when he spoke alone to himself. "Then, might I ask what you've done that you feel should be so remembered? In your own words." The old Sif smiled even wider, and some measures of sadness in his face changed simply to lines of age and wisdom. With wizened eyes, both thoughtful and bright, he pinched at his long white beard and dragged his grip to the ends. Here and there he puffed at his pipe and went on to tell stories of his deeds. He explained much of his long life and told how he himself had been the one to teach Julius Ardifir the art of dommels. Gerald was one of the best on the entire island at his work, and showed it well with the mastery with which his home had been constructed. He'd built the great home tree in Elumwar, where the festival's deepest honors were held. It was after a pause and some deep thought that he went on. "There are things that I would have remembered also, but perhaps not told until after I'm gone, if you're willing to spin those webs for me and my kin. Even now my children are long gone and dead, and their children too. The lad upstairs is 8 greats my grandson, and he knows not of my deeds long ago. Nay, nor would I tell him. He's the only other of my family still near enough to listen, but too young to hear such things. Of course, I'll tell you a tale when you're gone from this land on the winds of peace to watch over us at length, but I have a simple question before we begin it." Finley presented his knife thoughtfully, and as the old Sif glanced over its heft, his eyes sparkled, old and grey-blue like the sea after a storm. For a moment he thought deeply, and the wrinkles of his face redoubled from his forehead's awkward tension. The old Sif smiled with deep, long-held words, and his eyes closed for a moment. Before he went on, he made a solemn promise. "For your promise I cannot thank you with words, save perhaps some that you've not heard, and won't steal from other lips, stapled as they are by fear. Indeed, I can tell you of your family, and why I protect its legacy still. But first, I answer your question as best I can. While I can't speak to its full nature, I can tell you that this is no blade made by Sif hands, at least not those that I've ever seen. It's a careful work, greatly prized, that much I can tell at a glance, but there I notice, as I hoist it in hand, that I do not see my face reflected, and that's to be wondered at, truly. I'll give you my guess, ere as I think it. The blade was never meant to kill. No, indeed, I think that it couldn't, even if you dragged it across your throat. Seems to me a tool of life and protection of all things holding it. There is use in this, of course, for us, but specially made, I should think, for those who would not harm the trees they shear. But alas, I can't tell you more. But now we move to things unlooked for until our meeting. Listen to my tale, and I shall weave another for you, not mine entirely, but related in no small way. Your great-uncle and his brother, your grandfather. Some small, true shard of their tale will I tell you, but alas, the whole is not mine, nor indeed any one person's to reveal, save for the dead themselves. And if they did not speak of it, then nor shall I at this time, nor indeed ever again. What I will reveal is what old Julius told me himself in no confidence, and bade me to hold to my own for a time. But that time's past, and only the words marked as true secret will be withheld this morning. Does that please you at least? Is that payment enough for your assistance in my own story?" Finley nodded, and settled in for both stories, puffing at times on the pipe to refresh his nerves as matters threatened to grow somewhat concerning. At first, the old Sith told of his brief adventure, and defended greatly that it was not one to be mocked, or indeed to be misjudged as folly. For I had need of a curative, and that our people do not make as strong as they do elsewhere. My daughter, not long after her first child was born, fell terribly ill. The same happened to your mother, and so will mark a common point in our tales. Indeed, in places our tales are deeply intertwined, and you must judge what is your father's, and what's mine. I have not the energy to tell it all separate. I had, in my youth, spied a vision at the festival, and later heard a tale to match it. When the flames danced in strange shapes, I saw a lovely figure, surely a woman, strong and true, and further still than any Sith had ever gone. I felt the weight of her strong, healing hands, and I knew when sickness came that she had the power to heal that which ailed my daughter. And so I searched for legends, and indeed searched for passage from our lands, and in doing so I learned of the North Gap, a place of old stories where many are said to have died in foolishness. But foolishness was required, and bravery certainly, to dare and try to cross the mottled islands that raise from the water ere the tide is low and the season is right. In late autumn, it is said that it is passable during early night and early morning, twice in one day, but for no more than 2 hours. If pace was slow, or indeed the will lacking, I would perish by the tide and be washed away. So rush I did, and in great need my strength was reinforced, my resolve like armour against the weakness of joint and muscle fibre. I made the major crossing, but indeed was washed away near the end of my path. Still, I'd gotten far, and I ended up on the shores across the North Wash ere I was done drifting. It's forbidden to say what I saw beyond, and as an elder, I must respect that forbiddance. But I went far, and journeyed hard through strange lands, and in time returned stronger and wiser, and with a power in my breast and a cure in my pocket. My daughter was saved, but never could I tell of what I'd seen beyond, and that's why my tale must be stayed until I'm gone, and my follies are somewhat forgiven by my death and old age. Indeed, I have in mind that few will believe me, but as you know, I'm old, and I wouldn't have us limited and stymied by our separation from the world at large. There are wonders beyond the sea, that which we can scarcely imagine. Wonders, troubles. Certainly there are those too, but there's beauty. Beauty and life and creatures worth knowing. Men, yes, even men have their honours, and we mark them as demons and scum and nothing more. But I've told enough, and I grow weary. But I'll keep my promise now before my mind wanders off to sleep. Your father died while your mother carried you. He was slain on the war fields by the vagabonds who hunt and tame those beasts. He protected your mother, as was his way, and he promised to Julius that she would come home. She did, but she was gravely injured. A sickness fell on her from a poisoned arrow and many infected bites. Same as my own daughter, that sickness. Your grandfather sought me out, having been one of the few who had heard rumours of my travel from my own family, distantly so by then. He judged that he couldn't go alone, and I agreed with him after my own travels, and told him to bring Gardy, his staunch and strong brother. Though I'd misjudged Gardy, and thought him wiser than he was. It's my folly indeed that such tragedies came, as my suggestion went ill in time. But I'll get to that. Julius and Gardy were sterner folk than I had been, and made it across the gap without much trouble. Even they wouldn't tell me everything that happened beyond, but a few things I did learn, and they disturbed me greatly. Differing reports were brought from Gardy and Julius, and the latter I believe more, but should tell last, as that's how they were brought to me. Gardy came first, and he was larger and rounder than I remembered him. I judged that he partook greatly of foreign food and drink, and might never have returned have Julius not dragged him home.
He said that he had no more love of this land, and that the treasures he'd taken would serve him far better in the wide world. He told me that Julius never found the cure, and that he was injured as well on the crossing back and might not survive. I noticed all the while that Gardy was clutching a small satchel of something or other, and seemed very protective over it and secretive when I asked. It was 2 weeks later that Julius came to me and told me the truth. Julius had indeed been hurt during the crossing and abandoned by his brother, who'd stolen home after Julius was washed away into the sea. Still, Julius was strong and swam against the current for many hours until he reached the shore. He came to Gardy, offered to travel back with them across in search again of the cure. On their attempted crossing back, Gardy tried to force him over the edge of the gap and into the sea, right near the centre. But in the struggle, Julius ended up the greater and held his brother to the rock by the satchel between them. Gardy lost his grip and in releasing the satchel fell far into rough water, and there he drowned. Julius found then that the cure which he'd lost along their travels had been taken, and its value was 10 times that of any other thing they'd found. It seemed that Gardy had intended to pawn it, use the money to live a good life beyond the wash. Julius returned home to your mother, but the delays that Gardy made by stealing the cure were vast, and the further searching whittled away her time to nothing. She died of her sickness, and Julius disappeared. I was the last to speak of him, as far as I know, and he told me there was a grave issue, that he wouldn't risk his daughter's recovery by staying near her. Some horror that Gardy has done was haunting Julius still, and he wouldn't bring it to bear against his family, not against you and your mother, and she was already quite weak.
The old Sif finished, and ere his tale was over, he started to drift to sleep. Thank you, kind old Sif. I'll tell your story true, and I won't make mockery of your name with lies or additions that aren't deserved or necessary for the telling. In fact, I'll write it down, and while I know that's ill-taken most times, I would do it to remember best what you've told me, and all that you've told me. I have to leave, I'm afraid, but your tales moved me. I shan't forget you, not in this life indeed or the next. Have peace in your old age and be well. And Finley left to rejoin his friends, deep thoughts rattling through his mind through the entirety of his long walk.